Okay, let us begin. Hi, good morning, everyone. Okay, we'll start number 3 of our lecture. This is third week number 3. For just a reminder, this is about the modern church history, and we have discussed the several different definition of modern, M-O-R-D-E-R-N, according to historical scholars, and they have different opinions. But for this particular class that we are engaging, we decided, we have defined modern to be 1900 on. So it's 20th century and then part of 21st century. So we'll basically cover that about 100 years plus minus. But history never comes as a segment, meaning each history should define itself as as we look to the background, the context. So historical context is always there when we discuss the matter of historical subjects. Thus, it is inevitable to look back into something of 19th century, even to 18th century, to look at the significance of something that is happening even today. So, to have a valid and balanced discussion on the modern church history, we need to include some of that. And we have been doing an overview of whole history since the beginning of Old Testament. And even though we are discussing something that of 20th century and on, we need to go way back to the Old Testament period. And then we have covered some of it, and then we just begun last week, the age of progress. So the naming of certain age itself is a historical work. It's a kind of interpretation, and for this particular age, we say it's age of progress, which begins in the by the end of 18th century. See, so to go into early 19th century, we need to go back a little bit to the its background. And then there's a very historical events, as we have discussed, French Revolution, which is an expression of civil rights and civil movement, and awakening of general public or the mass, according to some of the historians or sociologists. They say it's a civil power, public, or the mass, or general public, whatever the name is. There are those 99%, 95% of people who were under the power and authority of that top minority, the ruling power. Then they realize they they even have that basic rights. And as we have discussed, the Enlightenment and the Renaissance all comes out of, very ironic, it comes out of the Christian education, the Christian belief. Even though the Europe had to go through the dark age, the Middle Age, which the religion blinded the mass. But eventually, as they begin to read the Bible, because due to the development of the printing skills, and then invention of those different printing techniques, they were able to print a lot more books and pages with a lot cheaper. So being it cheap, that means general public, they will be able to afford buy those books. And then they were able to not only read the Bibles and also these theological books, philosophical books, and so on. And that means when the printing becomes popular, when the books become cheaper, and that means the education becomes something not of ruling class but general public. So even the middle class people, the growth of middle class people by economic development, with the industrial revolution coming on later on, it kind of expands and explodes for the ability for those people to be able to read and get educated and understand the Christian message, which the Bible teaches. Every single human being on earth are created equal as the very valuable person of God. And God does not differentiate between the rich and the poor, and the royal and the slaves. See, that kind of idea, it provokes the revolution when they were oppressed up to the degree. And then because of that understanding of civil rights, and then these things happen. So, as a Christian historian or a church historian, we look French Revolution not just as a political event. It is something that it's a kind of sign of the kingdom of God, raising and uplifting human rights. So then we see very significant incident. William Carey, one of the Protestant missionary to India. He is also called the father of missionaries. The reason, he may not be the very first one, but he is the one who was outstanding as a typical missionary. Not typical in a way that he was sent as today's missionaries with a lot of money. Just money supported by the local churches and the missionary board or the mission agencies sending him to and helping him in the field. That's kind of dynamic, or the mechanics for the modern missionaries. But in the 18th century, this William Carey kind of volunteers himself to go to India, and he begins to live there as an immigrant to the country. So that's a little different than today's Christian missionaries. But anyway, and at the same time, as people are awakened, the general public are awakened, they begin to do away with their religion. I mean, when we say religion in Europe at this time, it's Christianity, basically. And so people do away with the religion, and there's some movements that begins to go against the institutionalized religion. And some even say that God is dead, no more. And in 1799, by the end of 18th century, Schumacher publishes lecture on religion. And that Schumacher's study on religion, it's kind of breaching the religion and secular thoughts. Then British and Foreign Bible Society is formed. That means missionary effort that began in 18th century, it faces the new era. We'll discuss this later on when we focus more on the topic of mission and mission agencies and so on. But that particular incident means that there is movement to organize the mission efforts, no longer an individual missionary is going by himself or herself to do the work, but there is going to be some effort to channel the finance and the missionaries, and also authorize missionaries and qualify them for the work. In 1806, Samuel Mills lead haystack prayer meeting. That's one of the key incidents in the missionary history. We'll discuss that later on as well. 1807, Wilberforce of England, he leads abolition of slave trade. And then 1810, American Board of Commission for the Foreign Missions. Again, the organization of the mission efforts, and it's organized to reinforce and to increase and to speed up and to professionalize the mission effort. So those are the contribution of those mission agencies, as we remember. The Wilberforce, as we know, he's a Christian minister and working in a government, and the Christian message and the governing the state. Later on, the state versus religion, it becomes a kind of counteracting or controversing bodies. But at this time, Wilberforce, as a Christian governor or government people, he leads and exercises the value that he learned from the Bible. So thus, abolition of slave trade, he believed that it's not God's design. It has never been. And it's against God's will. So soon as he realized and he works, use his power and his responsibility as a government person, public servant, to exercise his belief into actual politics or social work. So that's what had happened. As we go into the mid-19th century, there are also several development in both America and England and Europe. So what happens in the Europe and England and then in North America, that is basically the leading the modern church history, because there is no strong presence of churches in either Africa or South Africa or even in Asia. I mean, there are virtually none. And it's Western word and the Christian word. It was the synonym, meaning it's the same thing. But that changes as we face the 20th century. So last 100 years of Christian history, the modern history, the main difference, the major thrust of the movement, the Christian movement or Christian history, is no longer the Christianity is the sole property of Western world. So when we say Christian countries, now we have more of third countries than the European countries. Most of European countries, the Christians are less than 10%, right? 10% of population. So the Western world is kind of declining in terms of Christian growth and in terms of church, but other world, even though America is still, strong, is stagnant, but still sustains no longer is a majority, but still a big portion of population. But other than United States and probably Canada, the other European countries, England, France, Germany, Netherlands, all these major countries in Europe, except those Catholic countries in Europe, like Spain, Italy, Portugal. Those countries still, majority of population is so-called Catholic. Even though they are nominal, most of them nominal, still we consider the major population is Catholic Christian. But other countries north of those Mediterranean countries, or previously called the Catholic Empire, the other European countries are, significantly declining in numbers of Christian believers. So the major change that we are going to look at is how that Christian churches expanded to Asia, Africa, and South America. And 1835, Charles Finley, he's one of the leading revivalist and evangelist in America. So that's noted, which it means it begins to have that first awakening. And then 1840, Livingstone sails for Africa as an expedition and also as a missionary. I mean, it's a dual kind of thing. 1844, Kierkegaard writes philosophical fragments. That's very secular philosophy. And again, we have the movement of, it's hard to say non-Christian, but this is they are Christian, but nominal, and also have very strong secular thoughts, influenced by the Enlightenment and Renaissance. And there are those philosophers who kept writing and making the public to be aware of this new trend of thoughts. And Kierkegaard is one of them. Then Karl Marx, in 1848, he publishes Communist Manifesto. So by this time, by the mid-19th century, we see the shift and the change of paradigm, big shift in the Western world from Christianity and Christianity alone, whether it's a philosophy, ethic, or religion, or even the arts and the music and the culture. All these elements were under the umbrella of Christian belief, or the church, so-called Catholic Church. Then even the Protestant Church, still, even after the Reformation in the 17th century, they kept this dominance over the culture and everything that's been done in the life and politics and so on. But in this day, there's the beginning, and then it gets stronger and stronger. And the Karl Marx publishes this. But even this so-called communism or communist ideology is born out of Christian message. Actually, in the book of Acts, it is written, it shows the ideal of communism, sharing everything, and the rich giving his money and sell the house and the land and giving it to the church and the community, so they can share, and even the poor, they get that benefits. So that's very ideal idea of communism. And Karl Marx, he borrowed that idea from the Bible and developed his own ideology. If that communist ideal works, it's just the same as biblical teaching. That's an irony. But the thing is, in practice, in reality, that ideology never worked because of that human ego. And you cannot control or, change the inner motive of people with the institution or political system. That's why the capitalism is a winning idea for the reality, even though communism is more biblical. It's very ironic. Anyway, So we know that this Communist Manifesto, it changed history, and that even that idea, Enlightenment, Renaissance, and this communism, and then other secular ideas came out of Bible, based on Bible. Because Western culture, as we know, as we study, it grew up after the, Constantine of Rome. It grew out of Christianity. There's no other higher thoughts or philosophy or the worldview that can replace the Christian biblical one. So, 1,000 to almost 2,000 years, or at least 1,500 years at least, it ruled and dominated the European countries, the Western, so-called Western world. Only other worldview that were able to confront this Western biblical worldview was that of Muslim world. Muhammad and then the followers. So that's why there were the crusade and that crash between two civilizations. Because any civilization, to be a civilization, it has to have a certain very concrete and well-organized explanation of the world. And people kind of accept and believe it and even live out that worldview. And think of it. We do have some Muslim students in our class, and even the Muslims, they believe in the same Old Testament God, right? So the root, whether it's a Christianity or whether it's a Jewish faith or it's a Muslim faith, it all came out of same Old Testament, the same worldview. Only the difference is the interpretation of the salvation and the final of how it is going to end. That's a little different, but still we find that commonality, that common understanding about how world had begun and who had begun it and who rules it, and whether its name is Allah or Yahweh or God, whatever. That's the same God of the Old Testament, and Quran and the Bible, it shares pretty much largely part of Old Testament. So Western civilization and then this Middle Eastern civilization, it all based is fundamental and on biblical God. So that's very significant as we study and understand the world history and the church history. I like to make that point. And so again, going back to this list, 1854, Spurgeon becomes pastor of New Park Street Church. See, Spurgeon is still, one of the best preachers of 19th and 20th century. And the reason, that we may focus on these great preachers as their influence. And the preaching and the media kind of joins itself, it mixes. When it's integrated in a very positive way, it has very great effect. And the radio and television, I mean, it begins with the newspaper, and then the radio takes a big part, because you can listen to the sermon and the preaching, and you don't have to be there to listen to that message. There's a big difference. Before the radio, before the development of media and communication, you could not do that. That was impossible unless you were there. That's why they had, people like, where is it? Finney, traveling from this place to another state and another city and traveling evangelist, because they didn't have that kind of media to cover. But that suddenly changes the whole scene. So the importance and the use of a media for the church and the mission and evangelism, it becomes another tool for the explosion of the kingdom of God or growth of church. Then Moody. D.L. Moody is an important figure in a Christian education, especially for those lay people. So he institutionalized a Christian or the professional Christian education. And his contribution is it's right there in the mid-19th century. And the seminaries, it started earlier, but it becomes more popular and becomes something of normal for the Christian education schools, especially the higher education, the colleges and universities and seminaries. These becomes the trend. And because of those educational institutions, we are able to have that golden age of missionaries or golden age of missions. Without that kind of education, you are not going to be able to qualified or equipped missionaries. Thus, these mission works that not only it's been organized by the end of 18th century through until the mid 19th century, but it was supported by making that resources available. You have to go. I mean, when you talk about foreign mission or overseas mission, from whether it's in England or from America, to send them out to Africa and Latin America and in Asia, you had to have these resources, money and people, and then the organization. Because churches were already there and they had this zeal and then desire and the conviction to send out, because they felt strong call, because like that haystack prayer meeting, and then this young college students committing themselves for the mission, and so they saw the need to organize and work. Okay, let's have a short break here and we'll come back. Okay, let's continue. And year 1859, Darwin publishes on the origin of species. This particular book, or particular theory, I should say, it changes the thoughts of many. The thing is, when they kill God, say there's no God, and the God is dead. Once that's said, it's not the end of the discussion. It begins a new discussion. You have to replace that God, because any people, any right-minded person should have a belief system. And within that belief system, it's a human nature to seek, trying to find something or someone or even some idea to rely on the fundamental value to sustain his or her existence. It's very human nature. You don't need to teach it. You don't need to force it. It is natural for any right-minded, normal person to have that desire. That's inner desire. And we call it spirituality is a work of the Spirit. If you deny Spirit, then that's not necessary. But even those secular authors, philosophers, they acknowledge the work and existence of human spirit, which is invisible. It's different from mind. But there's something beyond the mind. There's something that you cannot explain with physical science, or so natural science, or even using the chemistry. I mean, some scientists try to explain everything with the chemical works that are happening in the brain, but they face the limitation, the wall, and have to acknowledge that there is something called the spirit. So it is human nature. It is embedded. You are born with. And trying to find the answer. The answer to the question. The question is this: where did I came from? Where did I came from? And why am I here on earth in this existence? What is the meaning of my existence? So that's so-called fundamental question, and you need to find the answer. So, by nature, any intelligent person is trying to, if it's not God, okay, let's say God is no longer valid, and they say God is dead. Now what? And what is the answer? And Charles Darwin suggests a theory. It's not so much of scientific work. He says everyone sees. He went to the island of Galapagos and find these different animals that are quite different from what he had seen in Europe. And he was fascinated. And one day he wakes up and he has this brilliant idea. Oh, it looks like there are similarities. I think it has developed from A to B and B to C and C to D and eventually. So that's theory of evolution was born. And he writes a book about it. He has never proven, had never proven his theory, but his theory, the myth and the story narrative and the great imagination, it's like a movie today. Many of the movies that we know that it's not real, but people begin to accept that theory because of that need for the answer. It happened natural. Somehow this single cell developed into more complex bacteria, and those bacteria somehow it began to evolve itself and became a semi-plant, and the plant and animal, it divided into two different ways for some reason, and they don't explain why, but at least try to give the answer to human existence. So, and eventually it becomes a fish, fish becomes a bird, bird becomes it becomes mammal and birds, and some of the mammals develop into more complex and more sophisticated entity, and then eventually become an ape, gorilla, and the chimpanzee, and out of sudden this gorilla and chimpanzee develop into semi-human, Neanderthal, and then from there it becomes a human being, a modern human being. So that's kind of theory that's suggested by Darwin. And because of the need for the answer, they begin to accept, and it becomes popular among the so-called intellectuals. Because they need to have some form of worldview to replace the old one. And 1860 U.S. Civil War begins, and it brings a tremendous change about the relationship between the church and the state. And then 1865, Hudson Taylor founds China Inland Mission. The China Inland Mission and Hudson Taylor is also a significant event, because very structured and organized effort toward the China and Korea and Japan, and they kind of became successful in China, but the Cultural Revolution, it brought down everything, and then since then China is no longer an open country to the Christian messages or the missionaries, and it's still the same, even though there is called Three Self Church as a government, controlled church, and we don't see that as a genuine church. That's how the Westerners or most evangelicals view the church in China. And in spite of all those persecutions and oppressions that are happening in mainland China, somehow the Christian population is still growing. And eventually, this growth of Christian population and real committed real Christians in mainland China, they are the ones who's going to change the history of China as it was in Korea. I mean, Korea under the Japanese rule and Japanese occupation for 36 years. We have 1910 uprising or independence movement, and to those, the movement was led by the Korean church. That's a history, and we'll see. I'm sure we are going to see pretty much the similar thing in China. Even though, I mean, as we see today, the China, the leaders in Chinese government, they begin to, more stronger oppression against Christian church, the underground churches there, and that means the time is almost up. Time is almost. That's a sign of the age, as we read the history. Anyway. So going back to Hudson Taylor, he's the one who organized this mission effort and begin major missionary work in China. And because of his work, we see at least 100 million plus believers in China today. 1870, First Vatican Council declares the papal infallibility. And that First Vatican, Vatican I and Vatican II, Vatican III, those are the major, landmarks or historical marks that shows the change within the Catholic system and Catholic belief. See, papal infallibility, it means the Pope, he cannot be at fault. Whatever he says and what he does, it represents the Peter's authority and even that of Jesus Christ. So this kind of, it troubles us, the evangelical Christians or Protestant in general, but especially the evangelical Christians. Who in the world, the human being, is infallible without error or without a failure? Well, that's nonsense. But in 1870 that had happened. Then 1880, Abraham Kuyper starts Free University. Abraham Kuyper of Netherlands. He is a very significant figure in a modern Christian history. This free church is evangelical. Free University is an evangelical university, and what he thought, he began to have this. This is not a new idea, but he's using his position and education, and eventually he goes as a minister, prime minister, I believe, the minister of Netherlands, and he gives that influence to the civil society. So now, at this time, in the middle of 19th century, there's there is a very clear and fine difference or fine line between the secular world and the church. So it's two divided worlds. Not only the state and church, but state somehow around this time, state becomes very secular, and the society especially the Europe. And this comes like a little slower in America, but in Europe, it's already after the post-Renaissance, it speeds up. So society and the church, it separates, as you know, as we see in the Darwin story. So there's a big schism or division between the secular society and the church. And Abraham Kuyper is the one who developed the theology. Not only the theology, he practices his idea about the state being ruled, even though the state is not church, the state being ruled according to the divine biblical principle. So this suggests a lot for us today. Today's evangelicals, we believe the divine principle or biblical principles should be applied to all the areas of human reality. Meaning, the secular society, as separated as it is separated from the church has the role to influence and impact and change the way this secular culture and the society is running itself. So that's very new. I mean, as we see, the Europe, before these changes that were brought after as a post-Enlightenment and post-Renaissance era, as it arrives. Before that, it was, church was dominant. Even the Catholic Church, the Pope, was above all the kings in those European countries. They have to submit themselves under the Pope, and Pope authorizes and crowns each king in different countries. That's how it was. That's how dominant was the church. Now that whole thing has changed. In 18th and 19th century as it comes, this church is no longer the state. And church and the state is separated. And these two different entities sometimes even confront each other. There's conflict and there are issues. And then this secular society finds a new paradigm, new worldview to answer the question of their existence and the reason. So now it continues to divide, and now the church becomes a minority. Even in America, the church is less than 30% of the population. The regular church goers are about a third of general American population. Even in Korea, in the 1990s, and even to the early year 2000, the church, they claimed they would have about 50 million. I mean, that's kind of expanded, but less 30% or 25% of a population are Christian. But that's no longer a case. I mean, the Protestant, 25%, and little less Catholics. But today, the Catholics probably remain the same, or it had increased more, but the Protestant population is decreasing rapidly. So it is beginning to become minority. So as a minority in a society, in the secular culture, what is our responsibility and what is our role for in the secular world? And we find the answer at the Abraham Kuyper. And Berlin Congress spurs African independent churches. That movement is significant because the Western Church recognize the autonomy of third world churches, or the mission field churches. There was this dynamic of father to son, or the lord to slave. That mentality was still there. As these white Western missionaries go into Asia, Africa, and Latin America, there was this strong mentality. Even they were Christians. It's not so much of racist. I wouldn't call it racism, but they thought themselves as older brother, least, if not father, or if not Lord. Whichever framework, paradigm you choose, there's still the commonality in these three relationships. So Western Church thought these African, Asian, Latin American churches to be under their authority. So who's exercising the authority? That would be the question. And this incident, the Berlin Congress, would be a very beginning of significant movement by the Western Church to recognize African churches or Asian churches and other third world churches that are called mission field churches, to be at an equal partnership. In practice, that takes a long time to really be the reality. But this is the very beginning of that movement, that trend. So even though it's not racism, they had that authority and lordship as missionaries, sending churches to the receiving church. So that's a very key dynamic that we need to look at as we see each relevant topics later on. Then 1886, student volunteer movement. That brings us to one large topic of the student movement, and the college students usually, and students in the world global evangelization. And for some reason, God had used these young people not only they are young, but they are highly educated in the universities and colleges like Cambridge, Oxford. He used them, he raised them to work for the kingdom of God. And that history still continues until today. And actually, I'm the one of those products, and I'm the one of those receivers of that grace, that movement. So we know that this movement, the student, God using young, intellectual, learned, educated people to bring the gospel and to extend the kingdom of God among those who does not have that benefit of gospel. And Billy Sunday is also one of those revivalists, starting with the Finney, and so this generations of revivalists takes a big role in the development and expansion of the gospel or Christianity in general. So we mentioned these revivalists from here to there, and they are one of those leading force and leading power in the expansion of North American churches. Okay, now we come to 20th century. This is what we are going to study more in detail for later on, but let's begin our overview. And it's age of complexity. As we know, as we live today in this 21st century, it all began in 20th century. All this complexity. The society becomes so complex. It was simple. When they were doing just farming and fishing and just simple trade, the world wasn't that complex. Some say today's the elementary students from age 6 to 12, they have to learn at least 10 times more knowledge than those same students of about 100 years ago. 10 times more, at least 10 times more. Then that kind of shows how complex we become. So, in this more complex reality, how the church should live and act and work and lead, that becomes the very question that we need to address in this study. So the reason that we are doing the modern church history is so we will realize and we find out what the role is for the church to lead the history rather than just be, dragged by the secular culture and society. It's sad to say that what we see today, with the church, especially as a Korean. If you look at what's happening in a Korean church, and if you don't know what Korean church is like these days, on the day that we record this third class, some of those who are watching this lecture may have already watched the so-called drama called Squid Game on Netflix, right? And if you have seen those episodes, you know how the Korean church is pictured in those episodes. And even though it's exaggerated, the church is no longer a leading and contributing entity in Korean society. They are mocked, they are made fun of, and they were criticized. And those criticism is not without merit. Means much of those criticism is relevant and valid, because church is no longer acting as light and salt in that society, and it becomes the subject of joke, and it becomes a subject of mocking, making fun of, because it did not do what it's supposed to do. And now it's about time to, look at ourselves as a church and ask the question, what does God want us to do or to be? So it's a question of being and doing for the church. The reason that we are studying this modern church history, if you're a Christian and if you're living in America, and many of you are Chinese born and brought or came to States to study and to live, if that's possible. So, what is the role of those Chinese who are abroad and living in other countries but still has that root in China and speaks Chinese and Christians? If you're a Chinese Christian or China-born Christians, you have very, very serious responsibility as people of God. What you do and who you are is going to change the history. Not only history of China. If the history of China changes, that means the history of the world is going to change. I read the news, today, and during these weeks, China is having shortage of energy. The electricity is turned off even in the city of Beijing, which is impossible to think of. Those are the signs of the age, signs of the era. And when that happens, it's not only limited to Beijing or some of the the big industrial cities in China. It's going to affect the whole world. The supply chain, and not only the supply chain, the supply itself. Much of the goods are produced in China, mainland China. And, if China has influence over the global influence economically, politically. See, what Christians do today, what you do as a Christian today, will change the history as we see in this. So let's go into 20th century overview. The beginning of chaos. When it becomes complex, it also accompanies the term chaos. Complexity never comes without having this chaotic situation. So 20th century, another word, is not only the era of complexity, it is era of chaos. And as we see the things that happened in 20th century, look back. World War I, World War II, and atomic bombs, nuclear bombs, dropping in Japan twice, and then Korean War, and the Vietnam War, and 9/11, and war in Iraq, Afghanistan. These things alone, these complexity continues up to today in 21st century. With the development of all these technologies, we think we live in a better world, but the history does not say so. We are facing more chaotic situation, more troubles than way before. You can kill many more people with just one bomb. That was never the case in about 100 years ago. So we are facing this new era, and then that's the discussion of this particular class. And see, I close this class of week number 3. For next week, as we begin real more serious discussion of this subject, the 20th century, think of what the church needs to do for this coming era as we reflect on the history in 20th century. So thank you for listening, and we are going to close the class number 3, and I'll see you guys next week. So have a good week, and see you.